Tonight, more deadly attacks in Gaza and in Israel. Loud calls for a deal to free hostages. Pressure mounting on the Israeli government as new truce talks begin, with experts warning about risks of a wider conflict.
I believe everything's on a tipping point right now.
A sight for sad eyes. King Charles delights the crowds in his return to public life.
It's certainly significant that the king was out in force today.
Plus, one of the cutest comebacks.
They're relatively short-lived in the wild. It's not an easy life.
The furry creatures that are no longer endangered.
CTV National News with Heather Butts. Reporting tonight, John Ehrlichman.
Good evening. Thanks for joining us on this Easter Sunday. We begin with the latest fighting in Gaza. More deadly airstrikes today. Nearly 6 months into the war, there are new aid efforts underway and a fresh attempt at a ceasefire. CTV's Jeremy Sharon starts us off.
Toppled tents and scattered debris, the aftermath of an Israeli strike outside a hospital today. Multiple people killed, dozens injured, including journalists sheltering here. They hit the tent without any warning, says this photographer. Israel says it was targeting an Islamic Jihad command center and killed a senior militant. It comes amid growing clashes between Israel and Hezbollah in the north too, sparking renewed fears of a wider conflict.
I believe everything's on a tipping point right now. And remember, Iran is the one that's backing Hamas and Hezbollah on this. So it is a dangerous situation. And I think that we do get more and more tense and more closer to that as time goes on.
While Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who promised to return to work soon before undergoing a scheduled surgery today, said this. We will go into Rafah and eliminate Hamas. There is no victory without entering Rafah, he said. Meanwhile, desperately needed humanitarian aid is on its way to Gaza, a 3-ship convoy carrying 400 tons of food and supplies.
We have canned product, we have flour, rice, we have dates, and these will be arriving the next days for the people of Gaza.
Easter Sunday in the enclave, overshadowed by the war. Christian Palestinians prayed in this church, many seeking shelter here, displaced from their homes. Just like Christ has struggled, we are struggling, says this Palestinian woman. While in Tel Aviv this weekend, a push to find peace.
We're not going to disappear, they're not going to disappear. The peace will take years. We can live together with the Palestinians. There's no reason not to.
And a call to get a deal done.
We want every hostage to be back home alive now. If it means that we have to do ceasefire, we do it.
Ceasefire talks resumed in Cairo today. Egypt and Qatar are mediating negotiations aimed at achieving an extended pause in the fighting and releasing Israeli hostages. John?
All right, Jeremy, thank you. And Jeremy mentioned protests in Israel this weekend. Today, tens of thousands took to the streets of Jerusalem.
This government is a complete and utter failure, and the only way they will lead us into the abyss that we will never come out of.
Protesters called on Benjamin Netanyahu to resign and urged the Israeli government to reach a deal to free dozens of hostages held by Hamas in Gaza. Scenes grew tense overnight when protesters lit bonfires and set up road blockages. Some demonstrators were taken to the ground and dragged away by police. And on the holiest day of the Christian calendar, Pope Francis renewed calls for world peace, a ceasefire in Gaza, and the release of hostages.
Non dimentichiamoci della Siria.
The Pope presided over Sunday Mass with tens of thousands gathered in St. Peter's Square for his traditional Easter address. This week is considered among the most physically taxing for the 87-year-old, as concerns have mounted about his health. King Charles also made an appearance on this Easter Sunday. It was his first major event since being diagnosed with cancer last month, and it comes 9 days after the Princess of Wales revealed her own diagnosis. CTV's Tony Grace has more on the monarch's effort to reassure a nation.
A smiling, waving King Charles leaving St. George's Chapel after the Easter Sunday service. That was encouraging enough for these well-wishers. But then this.
I hope you haven't got too cold standing.
A surprise walk-around with greetings and gifts. The King's first major public appearance since his cancer diagnosis.
Yeah, it was amazing. I'm shaking.
Looking well.
He's looking well.
This is a king who's an incredibly hard worker.
Royal commentator Richard Berthelsen says today was a message.
It was a very carefully staged moment, but I think the palace is at pains to show the king where they can, out and about, undertaking his duties to reassure the public that he's on the job and healthy enough to undertake those roles.
Only 3 days ago, the king expressed disappointment to be missing Maundy Thursday services, another royal family Easter week staple.
It is for me a great sadness that I cannot be with you all today.
With Queen Camilla stepping in at this and other recent engagements. The king's appearance today also seen as a test.
This is kind of a dipping the toe in the water to see how he gets on after this particular engagement and for him to be getting back into full public duties later on this year.
Absent from today's service, the Princess of Wales and her family, as she also undergoes treatment after a cancer diagnosis. Some in today's crowd telling the king,
Best wishes to Princess of Wales.
That Kate is also in their thoughts.
But I think she will return to the public sphere when she feels well enough, both mentally and physically, and when the occasion is right.
There's still no official word on the king's prognosis, though his travel plans in the coming months could offer signals, including whether he attends a Commonwealth meeting in the South Pacific this fall. In the meantime, no news yet on a trip to Canada. John?
Okay, Tony, thanks very much. Canadians who are on the road may notice higher prices to fuel up. The carbon tax hike takes effect tomorrow. The federal Liberal government pushing ahead with the plan despite plenty of pushback. Here's CTV's Rahim Ladani.
As part of Canada's fight against climate change, the price of carbon will rise on April 1st from $65 to $80 per ton. For most Canadians, they'll notice that jump at the pump, paying to the tune of about 3 cents a litre more for gas.
Gas prices will be in the $1.63 range, with diesel a little closer to $1.64, $1.65. And we haven't really started the summer demand driving season.
The Trudeau Liberals continue to firmly stand by the carbon tax, arguing Canadians benefit from it through rebates, which are also going up.
It is the most efficient way to do it, and we return all of the money. It is not kept. All of the direct costs that are paid in terms of the price on pollution are returned.
Many premiers, though, are pushing back against the carbon tax, arguing it is not an effective measure because it doesn't provoke further environmental behavior.
You're trying to get them to make really expensive changes to renovate their homes. And I just don't know that giving people a couple $100 every quarter is going to incentivize that.
However, the Canadian Climate Institute, an independent organization, believes the carbon tax is working. In a new report, it outlines that when all current policies are taken into account, by 2030, Canada will have prevented 226 million tons of carbon emissions. Of that, the carbon tax will have contributed to between 8 and 9%, or 19 to 22 million tons of avoided carbon.
The linkages between the tax itself, the application of the tax, and the fact that there was a rebate at the end, that miscommunication and the fact that that isn't clear to a lot of people is one of the problems for the Liberals in terms of trying to communicate how this thing actually works.
Ottawa plans to increase the carbon tax each year until 2030. Rahim Ladani, CTV News, Toronto.
And joining us with more on the carbon tax hike is CTV News pollster Nick Nanos. Nick, what does the polling data tell you about the popularity of this hike?
John, the carbon tax increase is a political hot mess. The polling data that I've looked at suggests that a very significant majority of Canadians are opposed to the carbon tax increase. This gets even higher when you get into Western Canada.
And so how is that sentiment influencing polling support for the Liberals overall?
It's been a killer for the Liberals. They're trailing the Conservatives by 15 percentage points. They haven't been able to make up a deficit in terms of polling numbers. And right now, they're trying to move the numbers. But the reality, John, is that tax hikes are never popular. And I think that's probably why the Liberals are in this particular situation.
And in terms of the road ahead, should we be starting to think about a federal election soon?
Well, I think if you're the Liberals 15 points back of the Conservatives, you probably don't want an election. I think for the Conservatives, Pierre Poilievre is probably talking tough and will want to see an election, but he's probably not going to get it. The earliest will probably be in the fall or perhaps 2025.
All right, CTV News pollster Nick Nanos, thanks very much for that breakdown. Meanwhile, there's another tax coming into effect tomorrow, a 2% bump on booze and beer. CTV's Kamal Karamali has more on how that one's sitting with consumers.
There's a chance you may now notice a bit more on your bill for booze.
There is a tax that is to increase every year at the rate of inflation. I think historically the thought was that we wouldn't see such historically high inflation rates.
The federal government was set to increase the alcohol excise tax by nearly 5% on April 1st in response to the rate of inflation, the highest in 40 years. But earlier in March, it announced it would instead cap the tax at 2% for 2 more years.
We're working with the industry and saw the need to control the increase.
Some looking at it as glass half full, others just see it as more out of their pocket.
It's done pennies at a time, but it adds up to millions and millions of dollars. Consumers can expect to see little increases in a pint or a bottle of wine.
Breweries, wineries, and restaurants will all feel the pinch and have plans to eat up the extra cost instead of passing it on to their customers.
Unfortunately, you can't always just adjust for your cost increases.
Some, though, say they don't have a choice but to charge a bit more.
People are suffering. We can tell that our sales dropped significantly with the interest rates spiking.
This comes as non-alcoholic options are becoming more popular. Vancouver opening up restaurants specializing in meeting that demand.
Think about the pricing and also think about the health impacts, and together I think that's going to impact the lifestyle changes that we're going to start seeing.
In response, the Ministry of Finance says by capping the tax at 2% instead of raising it to meet the rate of inflation, it's actually helping alleviate some of the costs of running Canadian businesses. John.
All right, Kamal, thank you. The promise of a much-needed bump in pay is no April Fool's joke for thousands of minimum wage workers set to receive a pay raise tomorrow. About 30,000 employees in the federally regulated private sector are about to get a bump of 65 cents. That will take the rate up to $17.30 an hour. Among those who qualify are workers in the telecommunications, banking, and courier industries. The bump does not apply to jobs that are provincially regulated. Changing course now to the Baltimore bridge disaster and the around-the-clock cleanup. Crews today removed the first pieces of the collapsed bridge, including a 200-ton beam. But that's just the start. There was a lot of heavy-duty equipment on scene, including 7 floating cranes, 10 tugboats, 9 barges, and 8 salvage vessels. Current priorities remain the recovery of the 4 bodies of workers which have yet to be found, as well as clearing a small channel to allow small boats to pass through.
Holy hell!
And another bridge was damaged after it was struck by a barge, temporarily shutting down an Oklahoma highway. The close call fueling new concerns over aging infrastructure in the United States.
Certainly this incident is going to give America's bridge builders and engineering community a lot to think about.
No one was injured, the incident coming just days after the Baltimore tragedy. Coming up, sparking concern across Canada. After a summer of smoke-filled skies, Quebec's forest fire season is already off to an early start. Plus,
very little we could do to recover them, and they would be extinct by 2020.
How these cute little creatures are making a remarkable comeback. About 70 million Americans are under threat of severe weather, with parts of the country already submerged.
This is nuts. Oh my God, this is so bad.
This incredible video taken from a passenger on a major California highway in Santa Barbara County. Cars were left soaked, stranded, and multiple people were rescued. The region was hammered by more than 5 centimeters of rain in just an hour. The storm system that pounded the U.S. West Coast is expected to move all the way across the country, bringing heavy winds, rain, and the possibility of violent tornadoes. In Quebec, less winter snow has created spring complications. Forest fire season started early. That included a weekend blaze, which may have been sparked by a cigarette. CTV's Kelly Gregg has more.
The spring sunshine at Oka Park means lots of hikers. But with no snow and only puddles of water, fire season has already begun.
C'est très tôt pour avoir nos premiers feux dans la saison, mais ce n'est
It's
quand même
very early to have a forest fire, says Stéphane Caron. But this year, with no snow cover, it's a situation we've had to prepare for.
couvert de neige.
This fire was likely started by a cigarette. It was spotted by a passerby who called 911. Firefighters from Oka and nearby municipalities responded, as well as Quebec's Forest Fire Prevention Agency, SOPFER. It was deep in the woods, so it wasn't accessible for fire trucks, says Oka Mayor Pascal Quilvillon. They had to take off-road vehicles to get to it. The park's fire risk level is already at high, and according to SOPFER's website, that warning level currently extends from the eastern townships to the Ottawa Valley. It's unusual. It's been a long time since we've had a fire like that in Oka, he says, but this is the municipality that has one of the biggest wooded areas in the greater Montreal region. Last year marked the worst forest fire season in Quebec history, with more than 700 fires that burned 4.5 million hectares of land. SOPFER says it's been seeing the season start earlier and earlier.
Au printemps, là, les
In the
gens
spring,
ne
people don't
soupçonnent
expect it
pas,
as much, he
mais
says, but it's one of the times of the year where there are the
plus
most forest fires.
Et,
They're
ils sont
smaller
moins
than the
gros
ones
que
we
ceux
see in
qu'on
the
voit
summer,
l'été.
but
Ils
often
sont
they're
souvent
close to
plus proches des
homes.
résidences.
The agency warns unless there's a period of wet weather, it could be another serious fire season. And as this one shows, it's already begun. Kelly Gregg, CTV News, Oka.
Still ahead, a possible breakthrough in the fight against HIV. The game changer discovered by Canadian scientists, and what it could mean for the future of treatment. Researchers in Ontario are making headlines around the world. Their efforts to find a cure for HIV have earned praise in medical circles. CTV's Rita Ismail has more on the possible cure, bringing new hope to millions of people.
This group of researchers from Western University is a part of an international team working on a project that could mean a cure for HIV.
We've had this discovery that we're able to drive out the virus 100 times more efficiently than anything that's been attempted before.
There are over 30 million people around the world currently receiving lifelong treatment. Researchers have slowly been making progress towards finding a cure.
One of the reasons why our approach may work in patients is because it targets the cells that retain that small amount. And it's like targeting a needle in a haystack, quite literally.
A study tested the HIV-like particle intervention on blood samples from people on long-term HIV treatment drugs in Uganda, Canada, and Cleveland, Ohio.
We determined that it actually takes, surprisingly, the virus that a person is infected with in a dead form, so it can't cause any harm. But that's enough to tease the immune system, to tickle it, and specifically tickle the cells that have the remnant HIV in it.
The hope that comes with this study is one that has potential global impact.
Impact that Martin McIntosh says is profound. The executive director of HIV/AIDS Connection appreciates firsthand the significance of this advancement in research.
People living with HIV, such as myself, are living good, healthy lives. Thanks to the advancements of science and research that has been going on over the past several decades. What this means to me today is a sense of hope.
Ryan Ho, the co-lead author of the study, volunteered with HIV/AIDS Connection for the past 2 years, something that McIntosh says forms a bridge between research and community.
He shows up to understand that the research being done in the lab is about people.
The intervention is set for human trials later this year. Rita Ismail, CTV News.
A larger-than-life Canadian basketball star reached a March Madness milestone today. Zach Edey led his team to the Final Four.
For me to be able to pay back for Coach Payne for really believing in me is it's amazing.
The 7'4" Toronto native led Purdue to a 72-66 win over Tennessee. Edey scored a career-high 40 points and grabbed 16 rebounds. It's a redemption story for Purdue, who were knocked out in last year's first round. They will now face North Carolina State with a place in the national final up for grabs. After the break, an East Coast comeback tale. The elusive little critters climbing back from the brink of extinction. We leave you tonight with a comeback story. This one comes from the animal kingdom. A furry critter is no longer endangered thanks to big efforts on Canada's East Coast. Here's CTV's Garrett Berry on the survival strategy.
She's 15 years old and about the size of a house cat. This Newfoundland marten is one of the oldest you'll ever find.
They're relatively short-lived in the wild. It's not an easy life. I think the oldest one we captured was around 11 or 12.
For most Newfoundlanders and Labradorians, this might be the closest you'll get to one of these animals. They're small and they like to keep to themselves. But on a sunny morning, for us, this female emerged from her den for a little run. Researchers now believe there's 3,000 of these animals in Newfoundland and Labrador. The population once numbered just 300.
When I started working on the best knowledge we had at the time from the best marten ecologists from mainland Canada, said that very little we could do to recover them and they would be extinct by 2020.
Hearn disagreed, but to save these animals, researchers had to learn a lot about them. Related to the weasel, the Newfoundland marten is bigger than its cousins in the rest of Canada. Centuries of island isolation made it unique.
The really neat part about Newfoundland marten is that they've evolved here on the island for the last 10,000 years since the last ice age.
It also roams much further, as much as 25 square kilometers. It was driven to endangered status in 1996 due to forestry cutting into habitats and accidental trapping in rabbit snares. New regulations to protect the animals have started to pay off. Now Newfoundland martens are showing up more and more, even in trail cameras, like this shot captured just this week in western Newfoundland.
I'm 41 years old and I spend a lot of time in the woods, and it's only the last few years I've been seeing them. I never seen them before until 2-3 years.
Certainly a highlighted career for me, and certainly the memories I have and the people I worked with were really a large part of what made this story so successful.
Garrett Berry, CTV News on Salmon Ear Line.
That's it for us tonight. I'm John Ehrlichman. Heather is here tomorrow. For all of us at CTV National News, thanks for watching. Good night.